Okay, welcome back. We're waiting. Looks like we're just waiting on one more person. Everyone, we have everyone there in the room.
Yeah.
We need a better name for the room. It has to be like the think tank or the yeah the hive mind or something. think think think
Okay.
the knowledge
I
tank.
thought I heard think. I'm like,
Okay. Sorry we ran. That was a little bit more of a run than we intended. So I hope hope that break was okay. And just a reminder, we're gonna be we have a hard stop 1 to 2 for our lunch hour, so you can map that one out as needed. And um, actually, I see everyone here, so I don't believe we have to do roll again. And let's go. Moderator, are we ready to go?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ann. Okay, moving to agenda item 12, review, discussion, possible action on regulatory proposal regarding continuing education fees, requirements, and approval process. And I will turn this over to Ms. Walker to give us the staff report on this agenda item.
Sure, thank you. And just real briefly, before I begin the staff report, if I could ask the moderator or staff to please display the text for the continuing education proposal that I'm going to be covering here today. Unfortunately, there's some incomplete text that was posted on the board's website, but we're getting that corrected, and the correct text is available during today's meeting, and it's the text that the board is going to be reviewing today. Okay, so we'll have that text up in just a moment so that I can go through it. Briefly, as far as this continuing education proposal, I truly understand all the frustration with getting this through. We're right there at the point of being completed for this. The board had previously approved text in April and July of last year that would amend Section 360 through 365, and then also adopt a new Section 361 to comprehensively update the board's CE fees requirements and approval process. One moment while we get that updated.
Thank you for your
Real
patience.
Quick also, the text is available for members of the public in the in-person meeting in Sacramento. There are no members of the public here. It has to be a new document. I just put it in the Teams chat.
And I am sharing it even as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Stu.
And the text Kristen will be referring to is the same as the one the board has received and reviewed. It just wasn't uploaded properly.
Apologies for that. And the item is loading now.
Thank you, Ann.
You're very welcome.
So what I'm going to do today is, especially for the benefit of the public, to be able to see what these changes are before the board acts on the language. So I'm just going to briefly summarize as far as reviewing that language and putting together our package so that we can put this out for public comment, and then really initiate the rulemaking process. We had encountered a few additional substantive changes that we need to make to our regulatory language before we initiate that process and submit to the Office of Administrative Law. There's two ways to go about doing it. It's like if we were to just put it out there in its current form and not make these changes through the board first, we would have to encounter and do modified text later. So it's cleaner if we just make these edits now and get a board motion so we can proceed forward. In summary, we're making a few changes. So the OAL's kind of standards are constantly changing, but one of the things that DCA is commonly encountering is that the phrase and/or is not considered to be clear. So staff went through and replaced all instances of where we had used that with or, where it had appeared throughout that text. Then we also added some clarification to section 361.1 that you can deliver forms to the board's office as your method of submission. And we also replaced the URL for the Connect system with on the board's website to allow for future changes to that URL without us having to go back and doing another regulation. And section 361, we added insert effective date of regulation to align our implementation date of these updated CE requirements with the effective date of the regulation. Previously, we had specified a date. The problem in doing that is we'd have to go back out for modified text if for some reason we couldn't meet that specific date. So by just using in brackets, insert effective date of regulation, that's going to allow OAL to insert that language for us when we have that final proposal ready to go. Oh, and actually, let me guide everyone through the text itself. So looking at page 1, if you could scroll to the bottom of page 1 is where we've added it, and all of the changes that are substantive that were made today, they're highlighted. So, or delivery to the board's office is pretty straightforward. It's just, since we had to make changes of replacing the word may with shall, we had to make sure we included all potential options for how you can submit these documentation to the board. So we added, the fact that you can deliver it in person. Page 2, please. Same change there at subdivision B, or delivery to the board's office, just keeping in mind that some people do hand carry applications to the board's office. Subdivision D is where we made that replacement of, it used to have the URL for the Connect portal. Now it just says on the board's website. There's always going to be a link on the board's website to get to Connect. So it's not going to be problematic for us, but it gives us more flexibility for, if that link ever changes, we don't have to go in and do more regulations. Page 3, please. Page 3, subdivision A, and then at the bottom of the page on subdivision C is where we've got that language I was talking about of insert effective date of regulation. That's going to allow for when the regulation goes into effect, like we file at OAL and they give us an effective date of, the first day of the next quarter, they're going to insert that, and that's going to be our effective date to start with these regulations. So that prevents us from having to go back and do a modified text simply just because we need to update dates. This gives us more flexibility there. Page 4, please. Page 4, we went through and updated some language for consistency when we talk about how someone's going to be granted their continuing education hours. We previously were using the term may, and the problem with using the word may in regulations is that you then have to define all the criteria under which you may or may not apply a specific item. So for clarity and simplicity's sake, we changed it to shall. We went with the language shall receive, as you see there, just for consistency with some of the other provisions where we had already used that term shall receive. So now, consistent across the board with those different methods of earning education, you shall receive those hours if you took them. Continuing on to page 5, you're going to see the same thing at the bottom of the page, the shall not receive. Before, the language was to the effect of, a licensee may not take more than 12 hours of continuing education. That term may is considered to be vague at OAL standards, so it's now shall not receive. And we don't have to define the terms when they could potentially get those hours. Continuing on to page 6. Again, another shall only receive, just for consistency there, replacing the term may. And then when we defined our competency areas there, where you see the two, F1 and F2, we've replaced the term and with, it was and or with simply or, just for clarity and so that we can meet that OAL standard. Page 7, at the very top, there's one little edit there, again, replacing and or with or. And then we can move to page 10. So the most substantive change besides the shalls and or may to shall and ors, which are, for purposes of our discussion, not substantive, but they are at OAL standards. The other changes that were made in the prior proposal, we were attempting to incorporate by reference a number of forms The updated kind of recommendation there is to instead just state the requirements that the form will contain in plain language in the regulation. That gives us more flexibility when things like the governor changes, or if a logo changes, or you just want to repurpose the form and the layout. You don't have to go back through and do another regulation simply to update non-substantive things on a form. So when you're seeing that highlighted text there, looking at subdivision C, where it talks about to apply to become a board approved provider, you have to submit a completed new education provider application containing the information required by the subdivision. And then looking down that page, we've identified what those requirements are. Nothing has changed there, where we're saying that the application shall contain the following. You know, they're identifying and contact information, the program's mission statement and description of their purpose and objectives, the disclosures of the information that the provider needs to make. None of that was substantively changed. It's just a matter of we took it from a form and just stated it plainly in this language. We didn't add any additional requirements or adjust anything. We just took everything that was on that form that the board had previously approved and just stated it here in plain language. And that continues all the way through page 12. And when you get to that subdivision 2 there, again, same changes, replacing the provider renewal application with language, again, just outlining what the requirements are for that form. So that language there continues from page 12 to 13, just outlining, you know, what's going to be disclosed on the application and the person that's going to sign it, and just describing the certification declaration that they're going to make when they sign the application. But nothing new has changed there, nothing that we need to bring to the board's attention. It's just simply the method of which we're going to implement the changes has been updated. Continuing to page 14, again, there was previously a form that would be used for submission of authorization of changes to the provider approval. Instead of replacing we no longer have the form in the regulation. We've now just stated the requirements. Again, nothing has changed. That's from page 14 through 15. It's all the same requirements that were approved last April by the board. And then similar to, I believe, I'm now at page 18, the same thing. So this is the application for board approval of a continuing education course. You have to submit a new course application that includes the identifying information, the title of the course competency area, each learning format, number of hours of instruction, each date where the course will be offered, the name of each instructor and their topic of instruction from the schedule, the completed continuing education instructor attestation form that includes, and then all of the following. These were all requirements that were in the prior version of the text. It's just we had it on a form. Now it's stated plainly here in the language. Getting to page 21, that's the provider's written certification of agreeing to all the terms that the board has laid out as far as approval of the course. Those were on the form itself. They're now in text here. And then again, just outlining the person that's signing it is really bounding the provider with that signature. It's just describing something that was previously on a form and now putting it in regulation. Then page 23, just a very brief one of those and ors that's always popping up is now just an or. That continues on page 24. We've replaced, where you see highlighted ors, it was previously an and or. And then describing the process for requesting a substantive change to a continuing education course. So we have, you know, if you're going to modify the course dates or locations, just the requirement there that you're making that written request with identifying the provider and the title and the course, and then basically describing which changes you're making to that schedule. And then the next subdivision there is describing how you make other substantive changes to the course and requiring that, you know, you provide a copy of any applicable documentation to support the nature of your request. Previously, we were attempting to put this into a form, but now we're just putting it in the language itself. That carries over into page 25 there, outlines the application for reapproval of a continuing education course. Again, these are all the same requirements that the board previously approved on a form, just now stated here in regulation. And those requirements continue to page 26. And then when we get to page 27, there's a replacement of the test shall include. It was previously may. The board had already mandated that, these distance learning courses, and these are not, this isn't your Zoom type live courses. These are the more on-demand distance learning, like traditional distance learning courses have to include a test. So it said the test may, now it shall include one of the two options that are provided there. Same with when we get to page 28, looking at qualifying for an exemption, it's just simply stating there that the licensee shall qualify for the exemption if they meet one of the criteria, and rather than may, because we would have to define that further if we didn't make that change. And that concludes the updates to the form. And then you'll see at the end of the text there, no changes there, still repealing the prior forms that were in regulation. It's just instead of now incorporating new forms by reference, you've got those regulations in the text. So thank you for your patience while I was running through each of those changes, just really for the benefit of the public.
Last thing is just combining 365.
Oh, that's correct. Yes. And then we did have, we also, the board had approved text separately there with 360 through 364. And then at the July meeting, approved the text for 365 as it relates to a petitioner. We're merging that all together into one package. So no changes were made to that board approved text for 365, but we are combining it into just one proposal here for simplicity and the fact that some of it is interrelated into the rest of the provisions in here. So with that, I want to just turn it back over to the board for hopefully a brief discussion there. What staff's really looking for here today is the suggested motion that's in your meeting materials there, where you're rescinding your prior approval and basically approving this new regulatory text as presented. And we've got that suggested motion language laid out in the meeting materials.
I motion that we rescind the prior approval of the proposed regulatory text from April 20th, 2023 and July 20, 2023. Approve the newly proposed regulatory text to amend California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Sections 360 to 365, and adopt Section 360.1 presented in the meeting materials. Direct the executive officer to take all steps necessary to initiate the rulemaking process. Authorize the executive officer to make any technical or non-substantive changes to the rulemaking package. Notice the proposed text for 45-day comment period. And if no adverse comments are received during the 45-day comment period and no hearing is requested, adopt the proposed regulatory language, regulatory change.
I second.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me open it up for discussion to the board. Any questions, discussion?
Ms. Walker, I don't seem to have my print off of the public members' comment. There was a bunch of questions on there. With what you reviewed, does that answer the person's questions, or will that happen at a different time?
I will respond to those questions in writing and share it with the board. Let me try to navigate to it real
Thank you.
fast. It addresses some of them, but
Okay.
yeah, I'll respond in writing.
Great, thanks.
Any further questions or discussion from the board?
Having made the motion and it being seconded, how confident are we that these are going to move forward fairly quickly as suggested by this summer or sooner?
Confident. That's Stephen's done so much work to help assist us in moving this forward. We've outlined all of these changes and gone through and justified what we're doing and why. It's just as we were doing that effort, that's where it comes to light that there's these additional problems with the language, that we could resolve them now and it would be more expeditious for us, or we could, if we tried to go down the path with them, with those errors, it's going to, in the long run, take us even longer. So we're confident.
Great.
Okay. Hearing no further question or comment from the board, moderator, would you please open agenda item 12 for public comment?
Certainly. We've opened up the WebEx hand raise and Q&A features to facilitate public comment. If you've got a comment on the motion about continuing education, you may look for the hand icon and click that to raise your hand. You may look for the question mark icon, click that, type the word comment in that text box and click send. Each person will have 3 minutes with a 15-second warning. And we do have a request for comment from Marcus Stretz. Marcus, I'll send you a request to unmute, and I'll give you your 15-second warning when you get there. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted verification. So we anticipate, Kristen, that this will be up and running by January 1st of 2025 with these changes. Is that where we are with this? The planning for all the continuing education providers is unbelievably convoluted even without these changes. So to have a heads up of when that's going to happen, I would actually start planning yesterday for it if I knew. So just to have some type of update. I know you probably can't tell us ironclad, but that'd be great. One other comment I wanted to make in terms of the revenue that's been generated. Last year at this time, sent in 43 applications for online classes. This year I sent in 12 for the same time period and still paid $3,000 more than I would have had I just done the 43 classes. So there's went from $2,000 to $7,000 and fewer classes. I just so vividly remembered as the board committee meeting was talking about diversity in education. That has completely been crushed because there's half the classes are being offered now that were offered before as I'm tracking them. So it's a sad moment. But anyway, would just like some verification of time element, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stress, for your comments. Kristen?
I can't commit to that date. I would have to say that, you know, if everything went right, you potentially could hit that, but that's why we did that insert effective date. I would say a more reasonable or expected date is going to be April 1, 2025, because by the anticipation is getting this package off to OAL for the 45-day notice, public hearing if requested over the summer, gearing up for the board to respond to written comments at the October board meeting, make any modifications to the text if needed, take that back out and then file with OAL. You're looking at the end of the year. So realistically, we're probably looking at April 1, 2025 as that effective date, just based on when it would likely get to OAL and filed and get there. Of course, we want it to be sooner if we can, but that's again why we didn't put a specific date in that text, because if we bound ourselves to a specific date, I have to bring it back to the board simply just to change the date that we can or can't meet. So that's the reason we made that change.
Thank you.
And I do not see any further requests for public comment. Shall I close that feature?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there any further discussion, questions from the board? Okay. Hearing none, Ms. Cruz, would you please call the roll for the vote on the motion?
Yes. Dr. Parrott?
Yes.
Dr. Adams?
Yes.
Ms. Cruz? Yes. Dr. Daniels?
Yes.
Dr. Sandino?
Yes.
Mr. Sweet?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passed.
Okay. And I see we're moving to agenda item 13. What I would just, if it's a permission of the board members, and just trying to be efficient here, I think we have a few extra minutes, and I'm wondering if we can take agenda item 14, and then we'll come back to 13, and then that'll take us into our lunch break. Any objection to that?
No.
Okay, great. Thank you. Taking agenda item 14, future agenda items. I would open this for discussion, suggestions, suggested future agenda items by the board.
Dr. Paris,
Yes.
I would like to suggest that we entertain or include Dr. Little and Dr. Bogosian in future board meetings to come in and give perhaps some insights into the changes with NBCE moving to the campus and some clarification there. And also Dr. Little, I think having him at least, once, if not twice a year to give us updates, because I know things are moving pretty fast with CCE and what's happening around the country with education, which I think is certainly going to impact California.
Thank you for that. Surely, I think that with the standards changing also, just another review, and we have some new board members who maybe hadn't been through that last excellent presentation by the Council on Chiropractic Education, which is Dr. Little, and the National Board of Chiropractic Examiners, which is Dr. Bogosian. I think we can, over our next two board meetings, would that be, we could have, one come to the next board meeting and then one maybe in October. How does that sound?
I think that's great. I just think
Yeah.
it's something that we should keep ourselves apprised of, because obviously Dr. Daniels is doing a fantastic job in the licensing, along with Ms. Cruz and getting us up to speed on all those aspects. And I know that they're in contact. So, but I think sometimes coming from the source is extremely helpful too.
Thank you for that. I would add to your suggestion also, especially considering our engagement with the Federation of Chiropractic Licensing Boards, FCLB, that maybe we have them come and do presentation to the group and an update also.
And we might even consider Karen Campion, including her in a future board meeting to talk about what's happening with the specialty. I think that would also be important for our stakeholders and licensees to know what's happening at the specialty level for chiropractic specialties, because that's moving forward and setting a standard which is going to be probably adopted by many of the state boards going forward with that new standard. So that it'll really streamline and clarify, what is a bona fide, accredited and accepted specialty within the chiropractic profession versus just, somebody just arbitrarily doing something without much oversight or psychometric evaluation of their board questions and their education levels.
Yeah, I think that would be probably included in a full like FCLB update, part of that RCSP program. So, yeah, great. Accepted suggestions. Anything else from the board? Any other future agenda items? Hearing none, I would have a suggestion, and perhaps at minimum to a committee, but to bring the discussion of the animal chiro back to the appropriate committee. I know we've discussed, is it as licensing or is it enforcement, but whatever the appropriate committee is, and kind of re-engage in those on maybe the next future agenda there. And also, I'd like to recommend as an agenda item the discussion around the fees and some way how we can help mitigate the fees and the costs, which we're hearing a lot of complaints, especially for the large events. So some of those larger triple track events that are, and maybe start the discussion there also again. So those would be my two future agenda items. Anything else from the board? Okay. Moderator, can we open agenda item 14, future agenda items for public comment?
Certainly. If anyone would like to make a brief suggestion of a future agenda item, you may look for the hand icon, click that once to raise your hand, or you may look for the question mark icon, click that, type the word comment into the text box and click send. Each speaker will have 3 minutes with a 15-second warning. Are there any suggestions for future agenda items? And we do have one raised hand from someone logged into WebEx as Marissa. I will send you the request to unmute. There
Thank
you go.
you. Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Paris for also including the animal chiropractic agenda item as a future proposal. We really appreciate the work you guys are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Appreciate your feedback, your comments.
And I do not see any further requests for comment. Shall I close that item?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Okay. Going back, agenda item number 13. Yeah, pleased to welcome Dr. Green, who is a expert for our enforcement program and also an expert in trauma-informed approach to care and I think administrative investigations. And so we're going to have a presentation and discussion and really looking forward to this. So thank you, Dr. Green, for being here today. And you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I am speaking at 12:15 and everybody's hungry and looking for 1 o'clock to come soon. So hopefully I keep you guys energized with this presentation. But I do want to start out by saying I'm going to talk to you about trauma-informed approach. And when you talk about trauma, it can be triggering for somebody who has experienced trauma themselves. And this really is the way that you would start the conversation on this subject matter, is to just recognize that and let folks know, like we are here right now, that if you need to step out of the room or take a break or need a timeout because it's stressful for you, that's certainly okay, because we're going to dig into this conversation of trauma. For those of you who don't know me, let me give you a little bit of insight into who I am. I've been a chiropractor for longer than I'd like to admit. I graduated from Los Angeles College of Chiropractic, is what it was called, in 1988, is when I graduated. Recently, I've been serving the California board, as an expert consultant. I've also functioned in that capacity for the state of Arizona, Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, as well as practice monitor. So I've got a bit of experience from the enforcement regulatory side. I also am a faculty and teach the subject of professional boundaries. And that is a situation where the participants are mandated by either hospital ethics committees or by their state board. I also interface with the colleges in Canada a lot. And consequently, as I teach those courses, I'm submitted pretty significant packages of information on each participant and the violation and the accusations against them. So I look at detailed records on a lot of folks on a regular basis. And in that process, I see signs of trauma on both sides, certainly for the patient or the complainant, but also for the respondent licensee, which I'll use those terms interchangeably as we go along, that being licensee and respondent in a regulatory, enforcement type of activity. So that gives a lot of insight. It also provides insight only because I interface with a lot of different state boards, also colleges, as mentioned, in Canada, but also from multiple licenses, MD, DO, NP, PT, DC, from everybody. So that gives a lot of insight as well, just from the different angles. And then finally, my dog's fussing at me right now. Sorry for the distraction. But then finally, I also, you're gonna have to be quiet, stop. So also I did a presentation at Federations of State Medical Boards last month, co-presented on this topic of trauma-informed approach as it relates to the regulatory efforts. And I'll tell you more about that later as we go along. So it gives you a little bit more insight on me. And so if you'll go to the next slide. So this whole idea of trauma-informed approach, and the reason I have this like the loading bar on your computer, and the reason I have that there for you is that just simply as it relates to trauma-informed approach, depending on the board and the agency, there are people who it's not even on their radar that you say, what do you know about trauma-informed approach? It's kind of deer in the headlights, to other folks that are like way ahead of the curve. The Ohio Chiropractic Board is one of them. They actually have part of their required CE for their licensees is that they have to do 2 hours of trauma-informed approach. It could be that or professional boundaries. So we do have our friends, they're at FCLB that are actually implementing this already. So that's a great thing, and we can look to them. Oh my goodness, you're gonna have to stop, sorry. As it relates to the spectrum of where people are at and where the California board is, if you're one of those folks who are looking at this and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know anything about it, don't worry about it. Join the club. There's lots of folks who don't. So what we're going to go through with our time today, if you go to the next slide, and here's my objectives for you that are more than just meeting in a room and talk for an hour, but the objectives are this, that is to go through definitions. I want to show you some statistics. We'll talk about the impact of trauma on people's health. It affects people, and there's physiological changes that happen to somebody who's exposed to trauma, and it certainly enters into the chiropractor's office. And then there's also trauma-informed care in the chiropractic office. What does that look like? How trauma affects violations, this idea of trauma-informed investigations. Then I'm going to give you 3 steps to implementation, and we're going to do that in the remaining time. So let's go to the next slide. So as you start to swim in the waters of trauma, you're going to see this SAMHSA, and that is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And that document that you're looking at right now, the concept of trauma and guidance for a trauma-informed approach, that came out in 2014, 10 years ago, wow. But that's certainly one that you're gonna wanna download, that's accessible, and it's an easy read. And whenever you hear people talk about trauma and trauma-informed approach, they are going to be referencing this document. And so the definition or the concept of trauma, as SAMHSA states it, is that trauma results from an event, and they call these the 3 E's. That's why I have them highlighted for you. So it results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effect on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And that last piece of it, lasting effect, for the chiropractor, that's really, really important to focus on, is that trauma has lasting effects on anybody who's exposed to it. Some do better than others, because certainly there are situations where 2 people are exposed to the same trauma and totally different outcomes as far as impact on them. And no surprise to it, a lot of that has to do with their social support. Family, friends, community, are they plugged in to some kind of social support? Those people who have that, they do way better than those who don't. And as you look at our culture today, one being of isolation, people are sitting in rooms in front of a computer and their group of friends is somebody on Facebook or something. That doesn't quite fill the bill when we're talking about the type of social support that makes the difference of adverse effect, significant adverse effect, and not so bad or minimal. And so that's a really important one to keep in the back of your mind those of you who practice or interface with patients, just to be thinking like, so what's your support look like? So that's those 3 E's of trauma: event, experience, and then effect. So if you go to the next slide. So what's it look like? Incidence of trauma in the way that I just described, different numbers that you're going to see as we go through this. I'm going to talk next to you about this term ACEs, that stands for Adverse Childhood Events. We'll look at that in the next chunk here. But just incidence of trauma worldwide, 1 or more is about 70% of the population, where you're like, wow, that's a lot. That's not insignificant. 4 or more, 1/3 of the population almost, and in the US, it's 90% of the population has had some experience with trauma. So if you go to the next slide, this is an important one. I'll read through just a couple of them to just get a sense of what the impact of trauma is on individuals. So, and let me just kind of jump ahead a little bit. So you get into, it is a really tough area to study, only because you have to learn a lot. And so maybe a couple of the chiropractors that are on the board know a lot about the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And for those of you who don't worry. The long story short is that it's this part of your brain and your body and communication and hormones and all this different kind of stuff, your fight or flight system, and it gets physiologically altered if you're exposed to toxic stress. And so consequently, you'll see these impacts that are listed here: difficulty regulating emotions. That can be physiologically, like their brain is altered in a way that somebody who's not had trauma, it makes it more difficult for them to handle stressful situations. So that's a big one to take in, only because it's like, wait a minute, you're saying they don't process trauma in a way that other people do? And the answer is yes, they do not process trauma the way, it's more difficult for them. So emotional numbness, depression, anxiety, PTSD. You can look at some of these under the behavioral column. Physical impacts, you're going to see higher incidence of chronic disease, chronic pain. That's a big one for chiropractors. There can be cognitive effects: decreased focus or concentration, feeling alienated, dissociation, and then certainly depression and loneliness. So it lets us see that trauma really needs to be on the radar for a clinician as they manage a patient, and particularly for a chiropractor. So for a chiropractic board, looking at trauma, it's like, wow, this is a big, we were just talking about, future agenda items. And like, boy, do we want to add this to the plate, because this looks like it's a big deal. It is a big deal, and it's relevant because it impacts how a patient presents, not just to a chiropractor's office, but any healthcare provider's office. And if they're impacted in a way that could be a comorbidity to the treatment, to the condition that you're treating, and certainly the conditions are within the scope of practice for chiropractors, then it starts to become a concern for a board relative to standard of care. And should we be kind of looking at trauma as we assess cases for negligence or incompetence? And is that a consideration? And the answer is it should be, but it's going to have to be slow steps to saying, okay, how do we thoughtfully address this and consider it when the enforcement process wheels start turning, and intake and experts and all that kind of thing. So it's important to look at that. All right, next slide. Okay, so in 1995 to 1997, there's this landmark study done by Kaiser Permanente down in San Diego, here in California. And it's what we have, the adverse childhood experience study. All of that data came out of it. And they, you can see some of the numbers there, 17,000 members. They did surveys, questionnaires, and what they came up with, if you go to the next slide, is they asked about 10 types of childhood trauma. So if you do an ACEs questionnaire, so it's called an ACEs questionnaire, for the sake of time, I didn't include all of the questions, but the areas that they asked, there's 5 personal and 5 family member questions. And you can see they have to do with abuse, physical, verbal, sexual, and then neglect, physical and emotional. And then as it relates to a family member, was there alcoholism, domestic violence, incarceration, mental illness, divorce? So those are the 10 subject areas for the ACEs questionnaire. And so then it's just simply, if you go ahead to the next slide, please. So then it's just simply check the box, yes or no, and you just get 1 point for each yes. And so, for example, I put checks next to these: physical abuse, emotional neglect, domestic violence, divorce. That might be pretty common. That might be a pretty common mix for somebody with a ACE score of 4. So then we look at this score and we start to draw some corollaries in regards to other aspects of their health and how it's adversely affected. And so with that ACE score of 4, if you go to the next slide, here's some things that you might find. They are, and here's the risk: twice as likely to be a smoker, 2.4 for hepatitis, 4 times more likely COPD, 4.6 for depression, 7 times for alcoholism themselves, and 12 times, which is really, really concerning, is 12 times the risk for a suicide attempt, and that's for an ACE score of 4. So if you go to the next slide, get a little bit more sense of how these ACEs occur. For those with 1 ACE, 87% experience 2 or more. So you check the box on one of those, and there's a really, really good chance you're checking the box on more than just the one. So if we go to the next slide. So let's look at some specific conditions. ACEs increase the risk of disease. So go back, I talked about that HPA axis. And the way that plays in is when you're in fight or flight mode, so somebody who's exposed to trauma, they're at a high level of fight or flight. They're ready to go, or they're hiding. And what that does is that turns on your inflammatory response. It elevates the chemicals in your body that trigger the inflammatory response. We call them cytokines. And so if you think about that, so whether you're a doctor or a healthcare provider in this group right now or not, just think increased inflammation sustained for a long period of time increases your risk for chronic disease. So that's why we see this slide here. And like cardiovascular disease and trauma, yep. Hypertension, obesity, absolutely. And we'll go to the next slide. We've got some numbers on autoimmune disease. Next slide, please. Come on, next slide.
Apologies for the technical difficulties. One moment.
No worries. And don't stress out about it. We don't want to increase your trauma levels. All right, so autoimmune disease, you see 1 ACE, that number should be switched around. 63% increase, and 4, you see these increases with autoimmune disease. Next slide, please. Oh, chronic pain. All right, so I got to turn sideways to look at that one, but this is a big one for chiropractors, and here's why. 84, so chiropractors see a lot of patients that have chronic pain. 84% of chronic pain sufferers report at least 1 ACE. So that, I mean, like, just take a step back and think about that for a minute. So should trauma be on the radar for a chiropractor? And the answer is, yeah, it really should, when you see all of these other comorbidities. So we look at this in regards to why would a chiropractor be concerned about this? Why would a chiropractic board be concerned about it? Because these are conditions that chiropractors see regularly. All right, next slide. So how common are they? ACEs, we're talking specifically. So 64% of adults have experienced at least one type of ACE before the age of 18. Almost 2/3, right, more than 2/3. So 64%. 17.3%, that's about 1 in 6, have experienced 4 or more. So if you think back to that slide that we were looking about, the 12x on suicide attempt, that's 1 in 6 patients walking into your office fall into those categories. All right, so how about, and here we go. Next slide, please. I made mention of that HPA axis, and you can flip to the next slide. Here's what we see. There's actual studies that show these are the cytokines that I mentioned, C-reactive protein, tumor necrosis factor, interleukin-6. So you see increases in these cytokines that drive the inflammation that's associated with trauma. So you can get into the weeds if we want to. We don't need to right now. But just to put it out there that there's this inflammatory component associated with trauma. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, and then how about this last piece as we look at it from like a community perspective, especially when money's tight. So what we see is the economic burden, and this is from, I think this is CDC, and it was just this last year, 2023, $183 billion in direct medical spending due to ACE-related adult health conditions. So it's a significant concern from that perspective as well. All right, so next slide, please. Are ACEs a big deal? And the answer is, next slide. Yeah, we're really fortunate. We live in California. We have this incredible resource called ACEs Aware. So acesaware.org. And it's got all kinds of training for providers, all kinds of information for the public. It's a tremendous resource, and I have circled there, it says the ACEs Aware Initiative is a first-in-the-nation effort to screen patients for adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, to help improve and save their lives. And in the fine print, I can't read all of it, but it mentions toxic stress. And so what I have next to that, the text next to it, prolonged activation, that's toxic stress. Prolonged activation of the stress response systems that can disrupt the development of brain architecture and other organ systems and increase the risk for stress-related disease and cognitive impairment well into the adult years. That's the definition of toxic stress. And so it's important to have that appreciation that it has profound effects on the developing child, that carry on into their adult life and significantly affect their health. And so do we as chiropractors, especially coming from a natural perspective and trying to avoid unnecessary medication if possible? Yeah, of course. We really want to be able to contribute in the unique way that chiropractors can, but we need to be mindful of it too. We need to be aware of what trauma is, how it impacts patients, know when to refer. So Dr. Daniels, you made a profound statement earlier when we were talking about AB 3127 and the mandated reporter, and you said, I can cause more harm. And that's so true as it relates to trauma and trauma survivors, and we're going to get to it in just a minute, is the huge potential to re-traumatize. So that's a big buzzword in trauma, is to re-traumatize, and we want to resist re-traumatizing patients, but also from the regulatory perspective, we want to resist re-traumatizing licensees if they themselves have a history of trauma. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. And so I threw down there's some books there. In the middle is like one of my favorites. She's incredible. Nadine Burke-Harris was our first Surgeon General here in California. And she's the one that really got the ball rolling on the ACEs program. And then so too, Body Keeps the Score. That's critical that you read that book and know about it. And then also Bruce Perry is a foundational contributor to the trauma approach method. And then I have down in the bottom right corner there, Becoming ACEs Aware in California. That is training for providers. I would encourage all the board members to take that training. It's great, it's easily accessed, they don't charge you for it, and that's a great resource in actually becoming certified in the ACEs approach. So we're lucky we're here in California. Anybody can access it, but hey, we're Californians and we love the stuff that we come up with. All right, so next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, trauma survivors go to chiropractors because they have conditions that chiropractors treat that's within our scope that's related to trauma, chronic pain, chronic disease, autoimmune disorders, and chiropractors like to treat kids. And so when you look at the statistics on ACEs, then there's a good chance that the pediatric practices are seeing a fair number of children that have an ACE. And so especially if it's something that's ongoing, they can be a positive direction, influence in the family and child's life as far as dealing with ACEs and dealing more importantly with the trauma that's resulting in the ACE. Okay, so next slide, please. So how's that happen? What does it look like? And what I mean by that is, what does it look like if you want to move in the direction of being trauma-informed? What's the trauma-informed approach? So once again, this comes from SAMHSA, all right? We can use some of the lingo, some of the acronyms. And so SAMHSA has what they call the 4 R's, and you see them highlighted as well here. And this is a trauma-informed approach. A program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed realizes the wide, so that's the first R, we'll call them the 4 R's, realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. They recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, family, staff, hello, all of us too, and others involved with the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. Okay, next slide, if you would. And so there's our 4 R's: realize the impact of trauma, recognize the signs and symptoms, respond. That could be by either screening patients, which is something I would say right now, just like to get it out there, is don't just jump right into administering an ACEs questionnaire. And it goes back to the comment earlier of I can cause more harm. Having a patient do an ACEs questionnaire and not have resources referring out, already having a team of providers in your community, whether it be counseling, therapy, whatever, but administering that questionnaire and not having a next step for the patient definitely could be re-traumatizing and cause them more harm. So that's why this needs to be such a slow, well thought out process, because it could be easy for some people to go, oh yeah, I'm going to start administering the 10 questions. I'm going to do an ACEs questionnaire. But that could be a mistake. And so respond thoughtfully by screening, treating, referring, and then the 4th R is resist traumatization. Okay, so let's talk more about the 4 R's. And next slide, please. So I've got to tell you, the good news is that chiropractic students are learning the 4 R's. How about that? And if you go to the next slide. And so our friends over at Palmer Chiropractic College, and that's Dr. Kira Baca. I was on the phone with her yesterday chatting a little bit, and she said that it was a-okay to share this with you guys, and she's excited about it, encouraged, and also our friend Stacy as well, Dr. Salisbury. So they did that. This is just last year. Go Chiropractors, Adverse Childhood Experiences and Trauma-Informed Care for Chiropractors, a call to awareness and action. And so they touch on the 4 R's. I mentioned the impact, physiological impact as the result of trauma. If you go to the next slide, I want to spend a little bit of time here with you. It was really smart what they did, and they gave us 3 vignettes with an ACE score of 1, 4, and 8. And if you'll flip to the next slide, we're going to look at the ACE score of 8. And I just want to, hopefully you can read this clearly. If not, I'll read it for you. And so here's what they have for the description. 58-year-old Caucasian male, middle class, white collar, comes in with chronic back pain. They were trying to reduce opioid use, yay. Has depression, hypertension, diabetes, hypercholesterolemia. He's only 58, irritable bowel, coronary stenosis. He's got stent surgery. Here's his ACEs: neglect, parental loss, household mental illness, domestic violence, household incarceration, verbal abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. Those are his ACEs. So in this vignette, the author goes through and gives us the 4 R's: realize, recognize, respond, resist. Realize chronic pain, comorbidities, and substance use may be due to physiological changes, chronic inflammatory state, and psychosocial factors related to ACEs. Oh yeah, I never really thought about that. But now that I know about ACEs, I'm like, oh, this is a consideration. Recognize that depression, substance use, unhealthy lifestyle choices may be coping mechanisms. So why are they non-responsive to care? Because there's more going on. And it could be a result of the trauma and coping mechanisms that have not been dealt with yet. So how do you respond? Suggest an ACE screen. Chiropractic care is indicated by the exam. Counsel on lifestyle. Can chiropractors do that? For sure. For diabetes, bowel disorder, prescribe therapeutic exercises for cardiovascular health, and then refer to a nutritionist, lifestyle coach, and psychologist. So you can see how they have their trauma team already in place that knows about trauma, and they can refer out to these people. And then resist re-traumatization. Ask patient what can be done to make them more comfortable. Reserve extra time because they're going to need it. You want to be mindful that they could experience a feeling of being dismissed if you're quick and abrupt with them because of their ACEs, and you read through what they were, how that can factor in, and follow through with care plans to avoid triggering abandonment trauma. I really wanted to focus on the next one, if you go to the next slide. And here's why. I'll just kind of cut to the punch before I read through this with you. Is as an expert, and when I review records for the boards, I see signs and symptoms of trauma regularly in the complainant patient and also in the respondents. Not all the time, but more often than you would think. But the statistics would say that you should experience that, you should encounter that just on the statistical basis. So let's look at this one real quick. 35-year-old Hispanic female, lower class, blue collar, chronic low back pain, pelvic pain, anxiety and panic attacks, chronic low back pain, fibromyalgia. You see her ACEs, household mental illness, household substance misuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse. You totally see like, yeah, that's probably pretty common. And so how do we handle her situation? All right, realize that chronic pain may be associated with history of sexual trauma. Recognize that panic attacks may be a coping mechanism in response to stress. How do we respond to her? Suggest an ACE screen. Chiropractic care is indicated. Prescribe therapeutic exercises. Refer to psychologists. Here's the big part. I want you to really focus on this. And I look at this and I think about this from the expert position when I'm looking at medical records. And it's this: ask patient what can be done to make them more comfortable. Leave the door open or have another person like a chaperone in the room during patient care. Why? Because of her sexual abuse that she's suffered. Give thorough explanations and warning, like informed consent. Informed consent's not a one-off. It would be very appropriate as you go through the examination process. Okay, I need to feel your neck and your shoulders. I'm going to be standing behind you. I'm going to feel the muscles in your neck. I'm going to have my hand on your neck. And are you okay with that? Are you comfortable with me doing that? Oh, sure, doc, it's okay. If at any time you don't feel comfortable, just let me know. We can stop. And you're doing all this standing in front of them before you go out of their eyesight, and you're standing behind, and could very much re-trigger or trigger a past trauma. So you can see how that plays out. Now we're starting to think, standard of care, is that what providers should be doing? Not a bad idea. Avoid removal of clothing during the exam by asking the patient to shift clothes if needed to avoid triggering trauma from sexual abuse. So if you go to the next slide, you can see how when you start to look at this, it really begs the question of like, so what should standard of care be? Not just for chiropractors, but just healthcare providers at large. But for sure, for a licensing board, what is standard of care? And when we start to understand more about trauma and the impact on patients, maybe we should be more serious about requiring our chiropractors to also be aware of it. I mean, that's part of what motivated the folks in Ohio to require trauma-informed approach as part of their mandated CE. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And I just wanted to end with this one, not in the presentation, but just this section, and I better speed it up, holy cow, is that we big time want to avoid re-traumatization. Okay, next slide. We're going to go full speed. Okay, do ACEs play a role in board violations? And you can go to the next slide. And so this study, these are all open access, so you can access them and download them yourself and read them. Here's a long story short on this one. Adverse childhood experiences in trainees and physicians with professional lapses. And so what this is looking at is licensees who have gotten in trouble for boundary violations. So it says 123 physicians trainees, meaning they're interns or residents. Boundary violations, disruptive behavior, substance use disorder. Look at the ACEs amongst the physicians compared to the general population. One or more, they have a 70%, it's a 70% rate, and for 4 or more, 22% versus 17.3% in the general population. And so under conclusion, you see in this sample, ACE exposure was associated with professionalism issues. And then if you go to the next slide, and it continues on, that increased ACEs equals increased professionalism. Remediation is more difficult. They're hyper-responsive, meaning they get stressed out easier. They're difficult to collaborate, and they have difficulty with trust, and they have decreased self-efficacy, meaning just getting things done, and maybe you'll give instructions to them, the board will, in the enforcement process, and they seem resistant, and that could be attributable to ACEs. So should we consider ACEs from an enforcement perspective? Darn right, it's certainly something that should be considered. All right, how about the next slide? Okay, does it play a role in enforcement? And if you go to the next slide. So at FSMB last month, one of the presenters was from Australia. They do things a little bit different in Australia with their regulatory agency. They have an umbrella nationally for all of their licensees. So they're looking at 880,000 licensees is what their sample base was. And here's the key thing on the introduction I want you to know about. A growing concern globally about the association between regulatory complaint processes and the mental health and well-being of the practitioner who is subject to a complaint. Previous research suggests that health practitioners involved in such a process can experience heightened levels of distress, anxiety, and shame, which impacts their personal lives and their families, as well as their professional identity and practice. There have also been tragic cases of practitioners involved in complaint processes who have died by suicide, which is a horrible thing to think that the regulatory process could result in such a tragic outcome, but it does. Now, I just want to preface the comments about this study by saying we're talking about the majority of respondents in a complaint. Yes, there's going to be the outliers, the bad actors, if you will, the person who's intent on doing bad, and we're not looking at that person. We're looking at the folks down the middle of the road who, for whatever reason, did something that was not smart, and now they're in front of the board. Okay, if you go to the next slide, please. And so what drove some of the stress for these respondents? And I am super careful saying what I'm going to say right now, because I know that all of you at the board work really hard to do your job and be efficient and just do the best that you can. And you do, and you get a huge thumbs up about that from me. But here's part of the challenge for a licensee. Poor communication from the regulatory agency, extended time to close the investigation, and then there's this question of management of health-related concerns. If you go to the next slide, and it's simply this. Perfect, and go to the next slide again, please. It's this: external factors in the practitioner's environment and personal situation significantly influence their experience of distress. For those practitioners with a health-related concern, most commonly a mental health or substance abuse disorder, the protracted process, the lack of control, and the loss of hope of practicing again compounded their existing health issue. And so is this the board's job to be, taking care of them through this process? I don't know if it's their job to do that, but are we concerned for them? I would hope so. And certainly a history of ACEs would be of concern. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. All right. So trauma-informed investigations. Just real quickly, you can go to the next slide. And we did our presentation at FSMB, and we talked about this very issue. I just give you the long story short is this: the enforcement process is likely incomplete without considering a possibility of trauma. So certainly something for the board to put on the to-do list is to consider this idea. You can go to the next slide of trauma-informed approach. And you can go to the next slide. And back up one, would you please? Oh yeah, we're good. Okay, go to the next slide. I'm sorry. Okay, so this was yesterday. So our friends at the Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy, they had a 1-hour webinar. There's about 80 folks in attendance. And the subject was this: implementing a trauma-informed approach in investigative procedures. Hey, they already did it. And I wasn't the only person there that was not a physical therapist. So there's great resources like this that we would be really smart to tap into and ride on the coattails of other folks that are a little bit further ahead in the process. Okay, next slide. So what do we do to start? Here we go. And next slide. Oh, can I do this in 2 minutes? This is so important to read this. Trying to implement trauma-specific clinical practices without first implementing trauma-informed organizational culture change is like throwing seeds on dry land. Go to the next slide, please. And here's what I mean by that. Step number 1 is simply start within the 4 walls of the Board of Chiropractic Examiners. Learn about TIA and TIC. Take steps to deal with secondary traumatic stress. That's the emotional distress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand trauma experiences of another. All right, look at each other on your Zoom or on your WebEx screen here. And those of you who are in the El Dorado room, look at each other. And we're talking about you. Being involved with board enforcement activities is certainly a source of secondary traumatic stress. And we'd be foolish not to think that that's not a factor for each one of us. So that's a great place to start. Train the team in trauma-informed investigations. Apply the trauma-informed approach to staff, board members, and third parties. Next slide. Resist re-traumatization, full stop. And then finally, last slide. Here's a lot of resources out there. And with that, I am done. Woo-hoo, right at 1 o'clock. Look at that.
Impeccable timing as always, Dr. Green. I think that was really great, and I'm really sorry you had to rush. We got you kind of rushing through the end there, but what I would like to do is I'm going to get us out for lunch here from 1 to 2. But if you'd be willing, I would love to get you back at 2, and we can briefly go through some Q&A, so we can kind of fully wrap this up. Is that okay for you?
I'd be happy to do it.
Okay, thank you so much. And is that okay with the board members? Any objection to that? Okay, fantastic. Well, yeah, Dr. Green, really appreciate that. I know we've discussed this in the past, and I appreciate your compliments to the board previously about observing some of our enforcement and that multiple members on this board have demonstrated some trauma-informed queries and with our licensees. So let's get you back at 2, and we'll go with the Q&A at 2 o'clock.
See you at 2.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much, and we'll be back to continue agenda item 13 at 2 o'clock. Have a great lunch hour, everyone. Dr. Adams informed me he might be a few minutes getting back. And I can't see, do we have everyone in the El Dorado? I see thumbs up. Okay, good. And Kristen, should we give Dr. Adams a few minutes, or should we get started and let him join in when he gets on.
Sorry.
In the interest of time, I would recommend that we go ahead and get started. We do have a quorum present, and
Okay.
we're not even taking action on it. We can get started.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's, if Ms. Cruz, if you don't mind, if you can just call the roll for us, and we'll establish the quorum, and then we'll open up agenda item 13 with Q&A for Dr. Green.
All right. Dr. Paris?
Present. No public no public attendees.
Oh, thank you. What's it called? Dr. Adams? All right, come back. Ms. Cruz? Yes. Dr. Daniel?
Present and no public members.
Dr. Sandino?
Present and no public members.
Mr. Sweet?
Present and no public members.
And then for Dr. Adams, I can just say.
We can come back, yeah.
Okay. All right.
The quorum without him.
Okay, we have a quorum.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let me open this up. Again, Dr. Green, thank you for that presentation. Let me open it to the board for any further questions or discussion. Are there any questions or discussion from the board?
Yeah, I had one. Hi, Dr. Green.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. Two things. One, I was wondering, is there a newer, 10 years is a bit old in literature, is there a newer study and process coming out than the 2014?
It's funny, 10 years can seem old, but I guess it's all relative based on, who's doing the research and what's getting published. There is a steady stream, like, for example, the piece that Dr. Baca and Stacy had put out. I mean, that was just last year. As far as like any major guides or anything like that from SAMHSA, no, those are the most recent ones. And as far as like updates and things like that, none that I'm aware of. Although I will say, like, for example, today at ACEs Aware, they had an hour webinar on how to reduce stress in the workplace for staff, like for DCA staff. And so there's ongoing trainings and materials like that. A lot of great places, and ACEs Aware is a great place to start.
Okay, and then my other kind of question, maybe comment, but mostly question, is you were mentioning one of the things that people, should do is ask, is there anything I can do to make you more comfortable?
Yeah.
My experience is a person that is a certain level, maybe a number of ACEs, is not even going to be comfortable with answering that question. May find it that they will just say, oh no, I'm fine, when internally they're not. They may not even know consciously that they're struggling with that they're not comfortable, that they may not know how to communicate what would make them more comfortable. So that's been my experience in practice, and it takes quite a bit of trying to really pay attention to that person of is what they're saying what they mean. And so I'm just wondering if in any of the trainings, and I'll check out that one that you mentioned, are they addressing that at all, as far as not simply just listening to the words somebody's saying, but really observing them? And then how would you go about and handle that situation?
Well, sure. A first step on that is simply to put ACEs type material in your office. Like, you could either have placards or a poster that just gives some like basic information relating to trauma, and like what I was talking about, like with not that you'd put HPA axis up there, but that you would put some kind of information that says, hey, your chronic pain and these conditions, diabetes and heart disease and high blood pressure, can be related to trauma. And if for more question, you could have like a QR code or ask your doctor or something like that. So you can certainly have kind of like, I hate using the term soft sell, but like a soft approach to introducing that. The other, and I'll tell you from personal experience, because I'm still in the office on a regular basis, And one of the ways I might approach that is to just say, like in a general sense, there's a lot of things that can contribute to this, and trauma could be one of those things that's a factor. And so that's why it really takes some thought and consideration on how you approach it. And a great place to do it is with your staff first, and dialogue about trauma as it relates to us as staff members, you and your clinic and with your staff, and just say this can be a factor. And how would you feel most comfortable being approached on this issue if you were a patient? So you can see how you can get like your staff buy-in by approaching it in a perspective like that.
Yeah, I think I was directing it more towards like the licensee and giving them more specific skills into, when they have that patient in front of them and the
Right.
patient says yes, but you clearly, if you were looking, they mean no.
Right.
And that's a very different level of sensitivity. I'm just wondering if any of the trainings are addressing that for.
Oh, yeah. There's so like if you went on that ACEs Aware website, definitely you're going to find a lot of material in that direction.
Okay,
like
cool.
hands-on clinical stuff. And that's what's so nice about California is that we can give that as a reference to our licensees here, and the fact of the matter is they get CE for that. It's CMA category 1 accredited CE. And so as far as I know, I'm not the expert on this issue. Maybe Dixie would chime in on it. But if it's category 1 CMA or CME, then I believe that that's accepted as continuing education, and you get a certificate and everything.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Any other questions or discussion from the board members? I had one question, Dr. Green. I always feel like during the enforcement process, maybe this is a blind spot in some ways. And so I'm just wondering, in your experience, where do you see, just boards in general, not necessarily our board, but where do you see in general where maybe the missteps occur, or the most common thing that that maybe is not a trauma informed regulation? Like what's happening in those boards, or like what's the actual kind of pragmatic example of?
Well, I can give you an example of one board, and it's not the California board.
Thank you.
There's another board, another state. Absolutely. We use the other guys. But anyways, it was another board to where it was a sexual boundary violation, sexual misconduct. The complainant patient had been interviewed, I know, at least once, possibly twice, which that's not uncommon too, because oftentimes a sexual misconduct case, there will be an interview from, a DCA investigator, most likely, whether that's in person or by Zoom. And then there's a good chance there's going to be local law enforcement could be doing an interview as well. So that's twice that person's interviewed. And from a perspective of trauma, you have to appreciate the fact that when they're asked to do that, they are reliving that experience. So everything that went along with that, the first go around, now that, when we talk about toxic stress and it being a repeat, I mean, the reality is simply by asking that individual to participate in an interview, you are asking them, hey, do you mind reliving that in detail all over again? I mean, that's like a big ask. And when you see it from that perspective, you would, like when you get the whole group together, it'd be like, okay, how do we do this one and done? We're only going to ask them to do this one time. We need to think this out, because it's not fair to that individual to say, come back again and again and again, recognizing the fact that they may very well have to if it goes to a hearing and now they're asked to testify before ALJ. So that being the case, understanding that in this one particular instance, the complainant was asked to appear before the board for another interview, and she declined to do so. And that is not uncommon at all, to where they're just like, you know what, tap me out. I can't keep reliving this. And one of the board members' response was, well, if she's not willing to come back again, it must not be a legitimate complaint. And so, you know, it's like, oy, that's tough. But it speaks to the lack of appreciation and understanding of trauma and just the little bit that I just described. And so it makes the argument, and by the way, in Georgia, their state law requires that their board members be trained in trauma and boundaries. It's a state law, a statute. So anyways, that's just one example. And then I've also seen it too, myself, when I've functioned in the capacity of expert. I've seen instances where when you know what to look like or what to look for, when you read the medical records and you've got multiple providers, documentation and stuff, you absolutely see signs of trauma that if you could do it preemptively, recognize that and say, look, let's be really careful not to re-traumatize this individual. Or the other approach is to act as if everybody's had trauma and just err on the side of being conservative, which you're not too far off when you see the numbers. But it all starts with knowing, having a really good handle on trauma-informed approach in the first place.
I have a question. Seeing it from the other side, we, as a board, we receive a lot of petitions, right, for folks to get their license reinstated, right? And so we also see it from the other side where we see the petitioner to get their license reinstated. You know, you mentioned before that the trauma experience is on both sides, right? So the former licensee is trying to get their license again, and we're taken through kind of the events. And the events itself is, in some cases, extremely traumatic, or even the fallout of losing their license and their livelihood and what they worked towards, right? And there's, you know, I want to recognize our board for the amount of sensitivity we've had towards that, but is there anything you can say, how do I say this? There's a need for our board to ensure a certain that there's a level of rehabilitation, you know, that is, at least we can perceive and see when the petitioner comes forward. At the same time, the whole do no harm, not do no harm, but the last R, right? Is there anything you can say, at least to help and guide our board of how do we approach those situations? Because essentially we are picking at a wound.
Sure. So, you know, it's a thin line to walk as far as trauma and a regulatory agency, because the first charge for the board is public protection. And so certainly you don't want to having a trauma-informed approach is not an argument for leniency. Oh, let's just go easy on them. You know, you never know. You never know. You never know what could have been in play here. So let's just go easy. It's not that. And in fact, the presentation at FCLB was on a remedial approach, which is where it's an interactive experience for the participant, where they're actually being taught proper boundaries, and they're being taught what appropriate professional conduct is. And it's done in a setting like we are right now. They're small groups, they're live groups. There's a faculty member that interacts with each participant. And they, not only that, so when I talked about having a bunch of records that I review before I teach those courses, I know the details of their violation, like all the details, like you know the details when you review a complaint. And so during that process, those individuals have to tell the whole group what they did in detail, because if they don't, I will ask them questions about the details of it. And so through that process, they have to articulate what it was that they did that it got them in trouble. And then through the training, they are then reflectively looking at what they did. And most importantly, getting the feedback, excuse me, getting the feedback of their peers. And it's not just within their license. So it could be multiple licenses that are giving them feedback as far as the appropriate conduct for a healthcare provider, for all healthcare providers, including chiropractors and nurses and doctors and PTs. And so it begs the question from a regulatory perspective. It's like, okay, so how do we do both? How do we be trauma sensitive? Like, how do we do trauma informed regulation? We can make a new acronym. So how do we do trauma informed enforcement? I like that better than TIRE. So how do we do trauma informed enforcement and also serve our number one duty, and that is protect the public? And so then that's where you really want to look at the remedial opportunity, where it's a serious process that they're going to go through after the stipulation is made, that they then really kind of report back to the board, like, this is what I've learned, this is how I've changed, this is what I now do different that I used to do, and that sort of approach, versus just like, okay, well, here's a fine and don't do it again. The outcomes are really quite different.
Thank you, appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Okay, let me give one last pass at the board for any questions, comments. Okay, hearing none. Dr. Green, if you're okay, I'm going to open it up for public comment.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, moderator, can we open up agenda item 13 for public comment?
Absolutely. If anyone logged into WebEx has a comment on the trauma-informed approach presentation, you may look for the hand icon and click that to raise your hand. You can look for the question mark icon, click that, and type the word comment into the text box and click send. Each commenter will have 3 minutes with a 15-second warning. Are there any comments on the presentation? And I do not see any requests for comment at this time. Shall I close that public comment feature?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Green, thank you again. Thanks for your work with the board and for coming and presenting to us today. And as we move forward, we, and I know there's other subject matter and even more to this. So we hope to have you back.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.